Good evening. My name is Takashi Shogemen. I'm Professor of History and the Head of the Department of History and Art History at the University of Otago. And I would like to welcome you all to the 2018 Otago Anniversary Local History Lecture. The Otago Anniversary Local History Lecture was established in 2009 to support, foster, and celebrate research on aspects of local and regional history. And it is my pleasure to introduce this year's lecturer, Dr. Jonathan West. Jonathan is a New Zealand historian broadly interested in the intersections of environmental, economic, and cultural change. His book, The Face of Nature, An Environmental History of the Otago Peninsula, was published by Otago University Press last year. And the book was based on his doctoral research, which was undertaken in my own department, in the Department of History and Art History at this university, under the supervision of Professor Tom Brooking and Professor Janine Hayward in the Politics Department. The book is now one of the 4 shortlisted for the Ockham Book Awards in the illustrated non-fiction category. So we very much hope that he will win. And let me add that Otago University Press kindly offer copies of Jonathan's book available for sale this evening at the special price of $45. Cash only, so you might wish to get your own copy after this lecture. Now, coming back to Jonathan's career, since completing his PhD, he has worked at the Waitangi Tribunal and the Office of Treaty Settlement. Now he's leading 15 historians there. This evening, Jonathan will speak on the conservation and the history of the Otago Peninsula. And so I would like you all to join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Jonathan West.
Thank you, Takashi. Thank you, Takashi, for your warm welcome, and thanks to the department, thanks to the university for hosting this event today. It's a real honour to talk to you today and share with you some of the material that formed the book, The Face of Nature, my history of the Otago Peninsula. I always love coming home. It still feels like home. I was described in the ODT as a Wellington-based author recently, which I didn't feel I could own to. It's true that I spent 10 years in Wellington, but I spent 13 years here at the university, many of which I spent avoiding this lecture theatre, actually, though I do know where the toilets are if you need to find them. I feel this honour most particularly because Otago is such a parochial place. I still feel very parochial about it. And reflecting that, perhaps it has the deepest and richest tradition of local history of any region in New Zealand. To cherry pick a few examples, the pioneering work of Thomas Hocken, of course, who collected all of those books and manuscripts that formed the basis of the Hocken Library, and on which a lot of that tradition is then built. His own work, contributions to the history of New Zealand, Otago. Of all of those 1948 centennial histories, one for every little town in Otago, and McClintock's big books on the province and the port, and then of Eric Olsen's very fine 1984 history of Otago. And historians in the university here continue to make a real contribution to the stories of where they live and where they work. Mike Stevens working on Bluff, Angela Wanhala, whose PhD was on the Kaitahu community of the Tairi, Tom Brooking, histories of William Cargill, leader of the first settlers here, and John Mackenzie, Eric again on Caversham, Tony Ballantyne, who inaugurated this lecture series, and through his work on colonial knowledge and the colonisation of Murihiku, or southern New Zealand, has continued to dedicate his scholarship to this area. And my book certainly owes a lot to them, and I'm really grateful for their guidance in this and many other ways. Today, though, given this is a celebration of Otago and of its local history, I want to acknowledge in a special debt to three especially local historians. First, the late Ian Church, whose more than 20 local and maritime histories are some of the most read books in our libraries, and who provided me with a constant stream, really, of encouragement and advice throughout my PhD, and who, before he died a few years back, left myself and Mike Stevens his extraordinary collection of history books in the belief we would use them well. And we finally got round to splitting them today, which is a bit belated, but nevertheless, I think Mike and I would continue to believe we'll write histories about this place through our lives, and today's another small step towards repaying Ian's faith in us. Second, to the late Hardwick Knight. He was very old when I met him. His memory had largely failed him. But he very generously lent me use of his photographs, several of which are in my book, and some of which I'll show today. Third, though, to Peter Entwistle, who many of you will know died just last week. Peter was a very fine local historian, lived on the peninsula when I knew him as a boy, wrote his own history of the peninsula, shorter than mine. Subsequently, important histories of the early Dunedin district. Peter read drafts of my PhD with very close attention to the facts, figures, and footnotes. Corrected many errors, for which I'm very thankful. And I'm grateful for today for a chance to record my respect and gratitude to to Peter. All right, the title of my talk today, Here Will Nature Be Triumphant and Bring the Mind to Rejoice. It comes from the journal of Thomas Ferens. He was on board the John Wycliffe on the 23rd of March 1848, when it first entered Otago Harbour to found Otago. Describing sailing down the harbour 170 years ago on what was to become Otago Anniversary Day, Ferens wrote, "The cormorants rose out of the water as we approached by thousands, land snipes, gulls. The scenery, as we gained Port Chalmers, where we anchored, put me in remembrance of a great part of the Cumberland scenery. The imagination fired, and here will nature be triumphant and bring the mind to rejoice and adore the divine being." Ferens was not entirely typical of the first settlers. He was an English Methodist, brought out to assist Creed, Wesleyan Methodist up the road at Waikouaiti, Karatani actually. And he was a well-educated lay preacher, not a labourer. But his reactions to Otago Harbour and its surrounding hills were, I suggest, typical. They reflect a settling people who fell in love with the beauty of this place from the moment they set eyes on it. And the burden of my talk today is to suggest the settlers who founded Otago saw the land that arrived in as somewhere akin to Eden, an untouched paradise. And their dream was that they might make it Arcadia, a place where they would live in harmony with one another and the world. Just as Ferens put it, here will nature be triumphant and bring the mind to rejoice. The seeds of conservation on the Otago Peninsula, I suggest, came with the first settlers. My first observation to that end is to note the settlers were, quite naturally, very keenly attentive to the natural world they were encountering for the first time. And off the peninsula the day before entering harbour, Ferens wrote of seeing birds of all descriptions are here: gulls, whale birds, sea pigeons, albatrosses, cormorants. Here we see sooty shearwaters, cormorants, mutton birds, off Tokihepa Island, which is one of the islands of Fovo Strait. Really the best example we have surviving of what the general landscape might have been at the point of arrival. And as a nod to Hardwick, a northern royal albatross struggling to get out of the water. he took this photo. On what has become our anniversary day, Ferens went ashore. Clambering into the bush, he, quote, rambled amongst the supplejacks, a description of cane, underwood, numerous cabbage trees, ferns trees, shrub plants, brambles, the pines are noble trees, and many others of excellent size and quality. In the forest he was struck by the birds, quote, birds of various species, thrushes, green and grey, robin with white breasts and brown back and head, linnets, buntings, tui, the mockingbird of the starling species, 2 white tufts under the bill and grey feathers on the neck, canaries, carcas, or the large parrots, parakeets, pigeons plentiful and numerous. Thomas Ferens' observations here echo other early descriptions, such as that of Thomas Shepherd, here with the first New Zealand Company expedition in May of 1826, which put Otago Harbour on the map for the first time. This is Heard's chart of Otago Harbour, and it shows, most significantly to my mind, that there were 2 channels that came in through the harbour. It was a sort of circular system, and in Māori tradition, Otago is the name of the channel that flowed in with the tide, and Aramoana, pathway to the sea, was the channel that flowed out. And you see the various kainga along the shore on the left, either side of the sandhill shaded brown. So Shepherd turns up with these guys. He too was a keen observer, landscape gardener, soon to become the first nurseryman of New South Wales. He identified a greater variety of ornamental trees and shrubs than at any other place in New Zealand. Or compare, hello Dad, David Munro, Scots surgeon, here with Frederick Tuckett in 1844, to choose the site for what was to become Otago. Munro, describing the typical Dunedin days he experienced looking out towards the peninsula from the harbour on board ship, wrote, "The sky a great part of the time was without a cloud, not a breeze ruffled the surface of the water, which reflected the surrounding wooded slopes, and every seabird that floated upon it with mirror-like accuracy. For some hours after sunrise, the woods resounded with the rich and infinitely varied notes of thousands of tuis and other songsters. I never heard anything like it in any part of New Zealand. It completely agreed with Captain Cook's description of the music of the wooded banks of Queen Charlotte Sound." And one of the striking things about Munro's description is the way it suggests nothing had changed in the 75 years since Cook's voyages, but of course, a great deal had. There'd been a lot of shipping and traffic on and around Otago Harbour. The world had well and truly washed ashore, which I confess is one of my sillier jokes. But there we have Le Breton's image, Moulage d'Otago, when here, in 1840, with d'Urville's expedition, and a sailor does indeed wash his briefs ashore. And we see the ships of the expedition off Otago at the harbour mouth, and the mingling of Māori culture, whaling culture, and the French scientific expedition. Ian Church's work has shown more ships came to Otago Harbour than anywhere else in New Zealand than the Bay of Islands during the 1830s, to hunt sea mammals and to trade with kaitahu. The ecological results of all of this were very significant. For starters, seals and whales virtually vanished. Norway rats were making mincemeat of many forest birds, and pigs were spreading, quote, like flocks of sheep. Now, Munro's is just one early instance of a long-standing problem, one particularly evident in conservation circles, where 1840, or thereabouts, is treated as some sort of primordial baseline, and the history of everything that happened prior is elided. Quite apart from the tumult that followed encounter with Takatapora, the people of the ships, as they were known in the south, rather than Pākehā, which was a later introduction from the north. This sort of tendency ignores the long and ecologically significant history of Māori in these islands. Thomas Ferens, in fact, met Kaitahu on that first anniversary day, as it became, in Otago. They shared their food with him. He observed those he met were very peaceful, intelligent men. Within a few weeks, he had learnt from them that tui had become very fat, round as a ball, can be easily caught. Pigeon were exceedingly numerous, fat, and of excellent flavour. Māori soon taught Ferens and the other settlers to supplement their food by baking fern root, eating fuchsia berries, cabbage trees, And they told settlers the indicators provided by other species for daily weather, good and bad growing seasons, such as the activity of feeding pigeons, the timing and abundance of plants flowering, and animals' seasonal movements. Like Ferens, all the settlers were impressed with the beauty of Otago Harbour and the peninsula on first sight. When the Reverend Thomas Burns arrived on the next ship, the Philip Lang, he thought it one uninterrupted scene of most romantic beauty. And Burns, too, was an especially close observer. He notably kept, for example, meticulous meteorological records, so that 3 times a day, every day, for almost 20 years. He recorded readings from his thermometer and barometer. He noted the wind. He described the weather. Every morning he recorded precipitation. And he provided all this information to the Otago Journal to be read by prospective immigrants and to the local paper, the Otago Witness, for the benefit of established settlers. And as Tony Ballantyne has argued, this suggests the arguments of James Belich, emphasising the settlers' practice to sort of systematic propaganda, a sort of dishonest, disingenuous account of a place where you can grow pineapples in Wellington, were pretty shallow readings of what was being provided by settlers. Like Ferens, the Reverend Burns was not above learning from Māori. Having noted that at Otago they planted their potatoes on headlands where there were more fertile soils derived from basalt, he too chose his land at Anderson's Bay on ridgetops, and when he came to plant his potatoes, he did so Māori fashion, often employing Māori labour. And this meant that Māori would plant their potatoes by laying the potatoes on the surface of the ground and piling the earth up around them, rather than digging a hole and putting them in and so forth. So you had this landscape covered in what appeared to be, quote, like molehills, which with the stumps, quote, gives it a very colonial appearance indeed. But the crops were good. Indeed, after eating the first food from his Otago Peninsula garden on New Year's Day 1849, Burns wrote that, even allowing for the wonderment of our first fruits, he had no hesitation in saying vegetables of every description here are certainly super excellent. Now, I exaggerate, because the anniversary day is a celebration. But we certainly could come away with the impression, reading just such accounts, that the first pioneer settlers loved the peninsula, its forested beauty, the variety of its plants and animals, were very close observers of nature, keen to learn from Māori, and, with their help, to make a garden of the new world. Certainly there's an innocence in how the earliest settlers saw and described themselves, captured by how the early settler and historian of Otago, John Barr, described their efforts. Quote, "We were in the pursuit of health, and had an ill-defined notion that somehow or other, let but the preparatory or preliminary labour of settlement be once accomplished, our toils would vanish, and the Eden of perfect rest and peace, into which we believed we had dropped, yield richly the fruits of this new earth, all but spontaneously to our hands, free of all those hard, inevitable requirements which nature and providence impose everywhere else, but false or true. Buoyed up by these dreams, we worked hard for a time with axe, grub hoe and spade, felling trees and uprooting flax and fern." And this innocence was cast by the early settlers themselves in explicitly biblical terms. As Eric has pointed out, the Otago settlement occurred as the Scottish Enlightenment fused praises to God and nature. The first settler spiritual leader, Thomas Burns, wrote to William Cargill, of whom Tom wrote the biography, "My prophetic eye wanders over the noble plains of Otago some generations hence to mark the future herds and flocks that cover the upland pastures far away, whilst the lower-lying valleys are waving with the yellow corn and the pursuits of rural husbandry, the pretty farms, the busy mile, the happy smiling cottages by the wayside or nestling amid the trees in some bosky dingle or sylvan dell, and all this amongst a God-fearing people with a bold peasantry, their country's pride, and an aristocracy whose highest honour it is to think they are the disciples of Christ. But I awake. It is only a dream." His daughter Jane Bannerman considered this dream was made flesh much sooner than this. God, she wrote in 1855, had brought the settlers to the promised land of Deuteronomy. A good land, a land of brooks, of water, of fountains and depths that spring out of valleys and hills, a land of wheat and vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey, a land wherein thou shalt eat bread without scarceness, thou shalt not lack anything in it. And the vision of the landscape Burns and the settlers strove to create was painted by them. I think it's shown in two images. First, by Edward Emmons Abbott's 1849 view of Dunedin, looking across from Little Paisley, sites for what is now the Southern Cemetery, compared to that of John Turnbull Thompson, first Chief Surveyor of the province, Dunedin from Anderson's Bay, 7 years later in 1856. To me, this confirms Dunedin people had only good things to say about the weather to outsiders. Yet another dunner stunner. More seriously, I've allowed the early settlers to speak in their own words and images at some length, because I think this helps restore a sense of their innocence. And this in turn may help unravel, hopefully, the choking cynicism with which latter-day historians too easily bind them. Just as the British Marxist E.P. Thompson famously warned against the enormous condescension of posterity through which historians have patronised the working classes, we should beware of regarding our settler forebears as fools, of too readily condemning them for being haters and wreckers, to borrow a phrase, who unthinkingly, unfeelingly, greedily ruined New Zealand's environment. If you think of much of the history that's been written in recent years, it reacts against a tradition of local history that celebrated pioneer settlers as ancestors who succeeded in forging a new society in a new world, and that was the tale that was being told. It's a necessary corrective, and it variously highlights the Otago settlers' undoubted flaws, their quick contempt for kaitahu, their insularity, and the undoubted damage done to the environment. Tom Brooking, for example, warns that the pioneer endeavour to improve the land is not simply celebratory, for, quote, the peninsula and the hills around Dunedin tell a different story, that their development, in Tom's view, represented poor judgment on both environmental and economic grounds, that this is because they could not sustain settlement and eroded away these greasy hills, as he calls them, and suggests they would have been better left in bush. I would quibble on three grounds. First, that the settlers had no choice. When the first ship sailed into Otago Harbour, the settlers looked out and said, "It's a bit steep." And Burns said, "Oh, don't worry, we're farming the Taieri." But didn't get to the Taieri. Burns never got to the Taieri for 3 years. So there was something to be done in the meantime. Second, the peninsula did sustain close settlement, very close settlement, very successful farming. It was just that once settler capitalism really took hold across the broader countryside, it turned to sheep, and settlement couldn't be sustained then. But arguably you couldn't get to the latter without having gone through the former. You can't just leapfrog things. And third, Tom argues that this urge to transform marginal and poor country was the most negative contribution of the Scots settlement of Otago. And in giving what is otherwise a pretty rosy view of the first settlers, I would suggest that their treatment ultimately of kaitahu was worse than the clearance of the land. Regardless, I actually think it's still more interesting to dwell on how much scientific curiosity, how much all-round ability, and how much determination the 19th century settlers showed. As Hardwick Knight said of the Peninsula settlers, in addition to their many farming achievements, which were considerable, this is one of their many stone byres built quite beautifully. They could turn their hands to many things Here's a stone wall still standing with a few repairs, but the method of those repairs having been handed down over the generations, some 150 years after it was first built. They could, in Hardwick's words, turn their hands to many things. They built, made furniture, could sink a mine shaft, construct water wheels, build a lime kiln, contract for works as large as Larnock's Castle and the defence works at the Heads, as well as make violins, milk churns, boats, and much else wherever one acquires into their activities. And a man such as Walter Riddell, one of my all-time favourite peninsular settlers, encompassed almost all of these skills himself. He rose from virtually nothing. He cheerfully countenanced a future in 1864 with plenty of hard work before me, as he put it, from a position where he had one cow, 83 pounds debt to the bank, on 50 acres of untouched bush at Sandymount where no one had ever settled before. And he rose from there to become foreman of works for Larnock and then manager of the Tidy and Peninsula Milk Supply Company, which basically sustained both the peninsula and the Tidy through the boom years of some generations of dairy farming. His diary is testament to his intelligence, skill, and gargantuan appetite for hard work. He described himself as, quote, 20 hours a day on my feet, in the effort to single-handedly complete the church at Pukehiki, for which he milled the timber and then built himself single-handedly. On one occasion, he joined the rest of the community and, quote, spent New Year's Day at John Matheson's dancing and making a fool of ourselves. Like the rest of the Scottish Presbyterians, this was really his one holiday of the year. They didn't celebrate Christmas. He considered it wasted a good day. So, however far we might say these Otago settlers fell short of fulfilling their Arcadian ideals, I found little or no sign of the, quote, fear and loathing for the forest. That's suggested as the predominant response to the primeval New Zealand landscape by the likes of Jock Phillips, who has embedded this interpretation as his right as chief historian of Te Ara in Te Ara, that now teaches our school children what's what. Perhaps, there was more of such responses in the north and west of New Zealand, where, the bush is not just dense, but everywhere and inescapable and omnipresent. But still, on the peninsula, the bush was dense. Early descriptions dwell on how hard it was to move through the tangled vines and undergrowth. Riddell's diary, for example, details how, when he arrived in 1864, it took his family 10 days to go 1 mile from the end of the road and carry their very few possessions to the bit of bush that was to be their property at Sandymount, where they were going to establish their small dairy farm. Here's the view towards Sandymount, painted 1 year later in 1865 by Nicholas Chevalier. Here it is again. That's the watercolour sketch. That's the oil painting that resulted 14 years later. Now, Chevalier is employed by the provincial government to paint celebratory advertisements of the beauty of New Zealand to encourage immigration. So he's in that kind of Bellichian camp where they are trying to make things appealing. Nevertheless, I would say 3 things in relation to these paintings. First, he does steepen Sandymount a bit, which is a sort of trope of the sublime. Second, I like to note the amount of kohai, which was actually probably accurate. Kohai was an incredibly common tree in primeval New Zealand. Certainly on the peninsula, sometimes its hillsides were described as being just yellow through spring. It's a bit like the kakapo, which I have a factoid in my head tells me was the 3rd most common forest bird of New Zealand. Again, showing that we have this idea that the current ecosystem is somehow a reflection of what was there in the past, but it's completely different. Third, he's plopped in a Māori family on the road there. You could say a lot about that. I'm no art historian, but I like to read it as akin to this image where a Māori couple trudge towards town, backs bent, better to counterpoint the advent of bustling civilization and the buggy that briskly drives down the peninsula on the freshly built road towards the settlement that's now underway. So, if the settlers saw the beauty, as I suggest, of the peninsula's forest, how did they feel about the fact they felled it? John Macleay, one of the first Scot settlers, came out as a boy, and he later recalled, when watching men clear land for themselves and for the Reverend Thomas Burns, he, quote, did very much like to see the sawyers felling the big totras, when they fell with a terrific crash, smashing all small trees to the ground. But at the same time, his love of clematis flowers in the bush meant he often thought it was a sin to cut the vines to bind shingles, and having witnessed over his lifetime the deforestation of the peninsula, he had come to feel it is a cruel shame. The ruthless hand of man should destroy God's beautiful work, all for the lust of money that sends so many to destruction, and for the want of it, misery, sin, and shame. This could all quite naturally coexist alongside the knowledge the forest had to be used. He next moves to include a list of the names of some of the best trees for sawing timber. So he is not a well-read, he's not a highly literate man, but his ambivalence is much the same as that which gnawed at Herbert Guthrie Smith's troubled heart, that most famous and most local of New Zealand's environmental historians, who after a lifetime of farming at the same time as recording the changes that he observed in his Hawke's Bay property, queried, quote, whether he had misunderstood the counsel of his Scottish forebears in feeling urged to destroy your fern, clear off your woods. Ought not he wondered, have heard them say, oh, be content to leave it alone, admire, conserve, let well alone. So, drawing a bit of a bow, Macleay, Guthrie Smith, same. I also suggest the rise of such concern for the fate of New Zealand's nature dates to the first signs of widespread destruction. Most often, written at a national scale, we see this pinpointed to about the 1890s, which was nationally when really forest cover was being reduced and had been reduced such that people were going, okay, this could be an issue. But as Paul Starr has demonstrated, in Otago you can see it much earlier. In the 60s, flowering in the 70s. And perhaps that's simply a reflection of the fact there wasn't that much forest in Otago to worry about, and when it was going, people paid it more attention. Certainly the evidence for this is found in the newspapers, which, like Paul Starr, I think very important, because through reading these sorts of sources, as you now can, through resources such as Papers Past, you can track a much more fine-grained, a much more local, a much more bottom-up sense of what is going on in a society without having to have your eyes go green and blurred through looking at microfiche. And around Dunedin, at least, you can see environmental concern emerging before and beneath the celebrated tropes of high New Zealand literature, in which the settler has his progress and laments it too, bitter price to pay, for man's dominion beauty swept away, as the hackneyed William Pember-Reeves poem puts it. Take, for example, reports of an anonymous Otago Witness correspondent from Anderson's Bay and Tomahawk. They would have every week, the Witness would publish reports from the agricultural correspondents from around the districts, many of them each week, what's going on, what's happening, a short piece of news. And in 1873, this person wrote the, quote, grass croppers making encroachments on the bush every year. In a short time longer, there'll be no bushland in this district. Next year, same thing, bush is fast disappearing, anon will be a thing of the past. Year following, however, he says, it's to be regretted. This magnificent forest, which clad each spur and gully of the peninsula, is fast disappearing. If the work of destruction goes on at the present rate, and not many years hence, few and faint traces of our indigenous vegetation, as far as the peninsula is concerned, will exist, while no one will deny the necessity of the ground being cleared. Many will deplore the scene once so picturesque as being so unthinkingly marred, and even proprietors themselves may yet see, and acknowledge that, even for personal benefit, its process of extermination has been all too complete. And that, for me, has always pretty much nailed it. That this anonymous correspondent accurately identifies that the destruction of New Zealand's natural environment in the 19th century was not a question of attitudes, but Perhaps it is that I am a fairly materialist sort of historian ultimately. But I think that the economy drove things here, and attitudes were largely irrelevant. Whether or not they liked or loathed the forest, each settler cleared their land as a matter of course from their own properties to farm. They couldn't use the forest. So as Peter Thompson, founder of the Dunedin Naturalists Field Club, the first of its kind around, said in 1865, when things are just getting going, though there are many large trees, yet commercially speaking, it seldom pays to cut them for the sake of the timber, on account of the difficulty getting at them and dragging them to a convenient place for a sawpit. So the plan, adopted all around the locality, is the simple one: falling, burning off. So in this area, some of the forest round the water, round to the edges of Otago Harbour, was felled, was milled, and it was boated to town, and of course some was used to build locally. But there still seems to be a bit of a persistent notion that the peninsula's forests were felled to build Dunedin, and they were not. They were burnt, and everything, the birds and the insects, went up in smoke with them. As Alfred Reynolds witnessed, quote, thousands, nay even millions of birds being roasted alive by the extensive fires, bigger birds leaving burnt bones on the charred ground, but smaller birds reduced to ashes with nothing left to speak of their existence and fate. Most species had a bit of habitat. They could survive in pockets in the peninsula, but kaka, quail, weka, white heron were amongst those that wholly disappeared pretty fast. And Reynolds bleakly concluded as a result that all the birds were destined to die out in the face of rats, cats, stoats, people, though perhaps, he hoped, the ocean wanderers might hold out a little longer. Applauding the creation of sanctuaries such as Resolution or Great Barrier Island, he called for conservation closer to home. So to return to my point, no one in 19th century New Zealand denied clearing the land was a necessity for every individual farmer. In fact, you were penalised should you not clear the land on your own property. While many in the community might deplore the cumulative result, what could prevent it? The idea the state might interfere with private property rights on productive land or potentially productive land was anathema. Anathema on a frontier settler society. When the Premier Julius Vogel proposed just that in 1874, he provokes an absolute storm of debate. Everybody, well, half the parliament gets up and speaks to his bill, one after t'other, and at the heart of what they say is outrage that the state might try and dictate what happens on private property. And it is the pattern of property on the peninsula that shapes the pattern of deforestation. So the peninsula settlers arrive and they intend to create mixed farms, farms where you have some crops and you have some stock and you have some gardens and you have some orchards, and they do not end up with that. They end up with a capitalist monoculture that is shaped by dairy farming, and that dairy farming is shown very clearly by this map, in which all of the yellow bits are dairy farming and all of the dark green bits at Addison's Bay are also dairy farming, but there's a weird thing in the sources. And the only parts in which there are sheep or anything else are right out on the outer edge where it's sodding hard to get to and you can't really run dairy cattle because you can't get to them to milk. So that means that when the settlers chopped down the forests, in the creation of that economy, they turned this, which is the peninsula's forests mapped in 1859, and you see the peninsula is pretty much forested, as is green, except for where things have nibbled away at Addison's Bay, and the whalers and the Māori have nibbled away out on the inner coast at the tip, and we also see that Sandfly Bay has begun to move, and we see the flats at Papanui and at Aukia. And you have this by 1900, one of my favourite maps. This is the compressed result of mapping, which actually covers 22 sheets, or even, I think that's just the peninsula, and ultimately there are more than 40 something, and they were mapped by the guy who eventually becomes Surveyor General over a year, paid for by the intelligence agencies of the time, who are interested to know exactly what is happening on the landscape in the event of military invasion and what they might need to do with their various defence forces around the outer edge of the peninsula. Only the military would pay for such an extraordinary mapping exercise. And this maps the distribution of forest very precisely, and we see little bits of it Only little bits of it, but little bits of it everywhere. And the reason those little bits are everywhere is that most 19th century peninsular farmers did keep a bit of forest so that they could use it, because it was useful, because it provided fuel and fencing and shelter. Now, those remnants couldn't renew themselves because the animals were mucking around under their understory, and so they were basically ecological slag heaps. Nevertheless, and you know, the effects of that are still being felt. Rimu, to my knowledge, only regenerate on a couple of properties around Hooper's Inlet, and otherwise not so. But it wasn't until sheep farming takes over in the early 20th century that farmers see little benefit in these remnants, and they prefer completely clean pasture. And this is a bit speculative, but I sometimes wonder if that's a kind of cultural reaction to the messiness of making these landscapes. And it's a bit hard to bring this up, but this is an 1880s-ish Burton Brothers photograph of what's Portobello now, and if I could get the zooming right to a scale which made sense for you, the landscape is just littered with broken bits of timber. Timber on the ground, trees half standing, little bits of scrappy scrub. Talking to a few peninsular farmers, they talk about how it was their granddads who really went, I want clean paddocks, thank you, and trees. I do not like trees. And that was when sheep farming took over. It was really, though, from this point that the landscape as we see it was pretty much in place. It was a farming landscape. It was a pasture landscape. This landscape was really made a long time ago by New Zealand standards. Other than on productive land, the government could intervene a little bit. It did at Sandfly Bay. It made that a reserve very early on. The provincial government, which had control of Crown land, made that a reserve, and it made that a reserve because the sand was on the move. Peter Thompson rambles there in 1870. It's already a reserve in the early 1860s, and he says, quote, instead of nursing and encouraging the growth of grass and vegetables on the sandhills, the settlers are allowing their cattle to trample and burning off the grass and scrub whenever they get a chance. And as he concludes, a process more mischievous and detrimental could hardly be carried on, as the settlers will very soon find out. It had already freed sand to encroach inland, swallowing the lagoon and marsh once on the valley floor. I see this as a problem of fencing and of collective action versus individual incentives. It's a problem of paper protection versus enforcement on the ground. They can make this a reserve, but they can't do very much about it. Similarly, they intervened to protect fisheries. Private property rights didn't apply to fisheries. The sea is an open field. Otago Harbour is easily the largest fishery in New Zealand in the 1860s and 70s. Key target species such as oysters and flounders are very soon diminished. The very first legislation in the colony to protect fisheries comes about as a result of the depletion of these fisheries, as a result of both Māori protest, but more importantly, settler scientists such as Peter Thompson putting article after article in the Transactions of the New Zealand Institute saying, these fish are disappearing. That flounder fishery has never fully recovered. And that was one impetus to the 1904 founding, largely the instigation of George Malcolm Thompson, of the Portobello Marine Fish Hatchery, as it then was, on the shores of Otago Harbour. And this, for me, reinforces a point I've alluded to earlier. Settler society was intensely curious about the new environment. Intensely curious. Natural science is taken very seriously. Scientific endeavour permeates society. At Little Sandymount School, for example, the teacher David Cosgrove and his pupils collected from the peninsula some 2,000 specimens for their Scholars Museum, all properly classified, each specimen having its name and locality written up on a card before it, including, quote, specimens of each group of the animal kingdom. The sponges, the sea urchins, the fish, lizards and birds are all beautiful objects, with the smaller fish and most of the delicate objects preserved in spirits of wine and bottles. There are a great variety of fine shells, fossil teeth, birds' nests and eggs, and a very few large moa bones. They had help from Frederick Hutter in assembling his own collection at the Otago Museum. And my point, I guess, is that the peninsula and the seas around it have always been something of an outdoor laboratory for science. As shown, if you look at the provenance of the specimens in our geological and natural history collections of the Otago Museum of Te Papa, and if you consider the ongoing marine science work conducted out of Portobello. So, if we take settlers' engagement with the environment more seriously, then I would start picking away at some of the myths I think we've constructed around what they did and why. First, I think we should revisit acclimatization. 19th century settlers are cast in a morality play as the poor old woman who swallowed a fly. They are castigated for ever more foolish successive species introductions to solve problems all their own making, with catastrophic results for conservation. Most obviously stoats. But of course the introduction of stoats was a vicious debate in this country. It was done over the heads and the strident protests of many people, many scientists. So sure, sometimes they were foolish, and the introductions were childlike in motive and means. Robins, for example, were, quote, introduced to show in the reality to Otago children what they've so often seen in their picture books. So they brought all of the robins with red breasts, which were therefore male. I would also acknowledge such carelessness reflected their unfortunate perception, as expressed in the Otago Witness, that, quote, to introduce birds, beasts, and fishes into Otago was something like writing on the blank page of a child's mind. But the British birds now most common around us, the sparrows, the starlings, the blackbirds, and the thrushes, were brought here to check the blasting plagues of insects that were making crop and vegetable growing completely impossible, and in that they succeeded. As Canterbury settler scientist R.M. Faraday argued, these birds were needed because man in his blindness is ever breaking, throwing out of gear some wheel of the great cosmical machine, and disorder necessarily follows. As Ross Galbraith reminds us in his history of the DSIR, it's not exactly as though we've stopped doing this. We haven't stopped tinkering. In fact, we're doing ever more of it all the time. Scientists continue to introduce huge numbers of biological controls for pests and weeds. Galbraith's contention is that none have ever gone rogue under that regime. We should note, and I guess I would add, and the 19th century experience helped considerably in setting a bedrock of experience in how and why to do this. Second, we should note too how settlers' own conceptions of what made this landscape beautiful mingled natives with exotics. William Larnock, who personifies boom-time exploitation of the peninsula from the 1870s, included many native trees in his extensive plantings around his castle. Baronial mention, sorry, I should say, for accuracy. A description in the Otago Witness of 1882 noted, here we see English and Scotch firs and elms growing side by side with totara and cabbage trees, while myrtles, laurels, and other shrubs hobnob with the native kio, pepper, cabbage, and fern trees. On this account, quote, there is not a tree, shrub, or plant indigenous to the whole colony which is not cultivated with the utmost assiduity. And the reason why Mr. Larnock's name should descend to posterity is the care and attention he has so signally bestowed in the cultivation of the native flora. Perhaps I wouldn't follow him quite that far. I mean, Larnock did blow himself up in Parliament, and that tends to win you a different sort of infamy, and the scandal is more newsworthy too. Nevertheless, perhaps his interest in natives has been overshadowed, and the way in which he wanted to construct a landscape around himself has been overshadowed by the personal drama of his life. Similarly, in 1901, it was said of George Malcolm Thompson, he, quote, knew his Dunedin like a book. He had lived here, a Scot, in Dunedin since 1871, become one of our leading natural scientists and historians of environmental change. No one perhaps knew better than he the extent to which the whole face of nature had been altered by 50 years of British settlement. If a Rip Van Winkle among naturalists could arise here, one who had known the natural conditions in 1849, And if he could be dropped down in Dunedin now, he would be astounded at the changes which have taken place. A very large proportion of the indigenous flora and fauna has disappeared. The ferns and other delicate plants, which formerly filled up the bush, are nearly all gone, dried up, exterminated. The big trees disappeared long ago. The undergrowth consists very largely of European plants. The birds are those of the old land. The whole face of nature is altered. And it was from this quote, of course, that I took the title for my book. Thompson had a particular fondness for the peninsula. He reflects at the turn of the century on the changes he'd observed around Tomahawk Lagoon. Goes from a prettily situated sheet of water, surrounded with bush and scrub and fed by perennial streams. He used to go there for ferns and insects. Now he has to go much further afield because the destruction of the bush has dried up the streams. The poaching of cattle has converted the lake into a boggy swamp. Settlement has scarred the place. Thompson, choosing his words with care, calls on a change. Now that the age of destruction has passed, an era of improvement might well be inaugurated by the surrounding proprietors. And with a little care and some judicious planting, the spot might again be transformed to a place of beauty. So, I'm suggesting that, on the one hand, by 1900, the peninsula is quite close to the Arcadian ideal those first settlers arrive with. They have established a dense network of farms. They have built tight-knit communities. In many ways, the rippling effects of those communities are spreading out across the country because as each farmer dies or must otherwise pass on care of the land, they pass on to the eldest son or the most interested son, and these people are having very large families of 10, 12 children, and those children are passing out into the wider landscape, feeding up into the North Island, and I don't know because I haven't done the research, but I wonder what the settlement of places like the Manawatu and other places might owe to attitudes born down here. Still, Thompson is calling into question the way they have so single-mindedly approached the task of hacking their farms from forest. His solution is to introduce white and yellow water lilies, the yellow flag, the yellow buttercup, many marsh plants, pretty marsh plants of temperate regions. He wants to make it a garden, combining indigenous and exotic plants. And it was also ultimately a plea to better tend to the ecology of a place that Thompson realizes, quote, is an extremely rich repository of living organisms. And this of course, is how we see the peninsula today, as an extremely rich repository of living organisms, as a place for wildlife. I have always hesitated to say too much about the peninsula as it is today. My research stops in 1900, and writing about the recent past, what lies within living people's experience and memory, is not to be done lightly. But I will conclude, if you're all thankful for that, by making 2 points. First, the peninsula today survives by making money from tourists. That is true of the nation. But I think it's especially important on the peninsula because it represents such a long and sustained and successful example of marketing a place to travellers. In the books that Ian left me, I wish I'd found this earlier, there was a little pamphlet about the peninsula produced by the JCs, I think in the 70s or even the 60s. I didn't check the date, but it's delightfully quaint. Anyway, the JCs, other groups, have been setting up the peninsula quite deliberately as the destination for Dunedin for a very long time. And what has been achieved as a result is extraordinary. And it's been the result, probably as all conservation efforts are in origin and impetus, from just a few people. If you think of Lance Richdale, virtually sitting on the eggs himself to hatch them. But, you know, there are others. John Gillette and a few others were the backbone of the Otago Peninsula Trust, which just celebrated last year its 50th anniversary as the first charitable trust in this country dedicated to conservation, which has run the Albatross Centre Glenfalloch, the lime kilns, Fletcher House. If you think of Save the Otago Peninsula, STOP, which stopped the prospective smelter over at Victory Beach, which stopped the potential for gold mining on Harbour Cone, which has planted out bits and pieces of the peninsula here, there and everywhere, and has really relied on the work of Moira Parker and just a few others to sustain that effort over several decades. If you think of Howard Magruder of Penguin Place, who's been protecting penguins since 1985. But those individuals have succeeded in cohering around them a really broad level of community support. So if we look at a place like Tairoa Heads now, yes, DOC are involved to a degree, but it's really run, as I said, by a charitable trust with wide public involvement. There's iwi involvement. There's the involvement of private property owners, all working towards conservation goals. 10 years ago, wildlife tourism on the peninsula was estimated to be worth 100 million and to generate 800 to 1,000 jobs. I don't know, you'd have to guess it has massively increased since then. It's notable how much farmers have been involved in generating this industry and in working very hard to conserve and protect the birds on their land. It's also very significant that from a farmer's point of view, bird tourism and sheep farming are pretty compatible. Birds not needing that much space, and the space they do need being pretty coastal, sand dune marginal. And I don't want anything I say after this to detract from the fact that this is evidently a wonderful success, and it is, as we do like to be told, the best example of ecotourism on this planet. But I still am a little bit troubled by it, by our reliance on it. For what do the globe's travellers come to see when they come here? They come to see the remnants of the birds, and they come to see the remnants of the settlers' past. They come to gaze at the ghosts of the 19th century past we have left in the landscape. I have come to see sheep on the peninsula as a little more than lawnmowers, keeping the landscape reasonably clean for our viewing pleasure, and that of the tourists whose wallets alone make retaining a landscape in that form profitable. This is the landscape once created in the 19th century that remains today because we don't really know what else to do with it. And the tourists come to see birds who are also perhaps living ghosts. This was a picture I had intended to put on the cover of my book, one of many supplied to me by Ian Thompson, who very kindly worked with me. But as we did talk about, whilst that is a scene one might see, he did kind of Photoshop the albatross on there. That perhaps is a metaphor for what we've done, really. But I wasn't going to get into that on the cover. That the birds in their fenced and trapped and planted shore colonies are ghosts is not as obvious as if we held them stuffed in museums, as our 19th century settlers did, in the belief they were destined to die out, being displaced by superior introduced competitors. Like these light-mantled sooty albatross, rare visitors to the New Zealand mainland, who, having arrived as rare visitors and being identified as such, were promptly collected, purchased, stuffed, and put in a museum. But the fact remains, sadly, as we probably all know, that yellow-eyed penguins may not survive. It's looking pretty dicey, despite all our care. And one colony of albatross, pardon me, is the definition of all our eggs in one basket. Further, even if we can protect the birds in perpetuity, even if we can continue to farm tourists who'll pay to see them, this should not disguise the fact, I think, that we don't know how to make a productive living here. We don't work with what lives here well. One example where we do, perhaps, is Southern Clams, which exports cockles. It's not entirely controversy-free, but all the same, there is a massive biomass of cockles around the peninsula, much, much higher than that of sheep. Just saying. In my darker moments, all of this suggests to me, still, we don't know how to live here. We're basing our future on displaying the ruins of our past, alongside relying on the fact other people have ruined their pasts more thoroughly. Colin McCann painted the peninsula again and again in his effort to convey his belief there was something logical, orderly, and beautiful belonging to the land and not yet to its people, not yet understood or communicated. McCann, in other words, says, we have not made our home here, Arcadia. We do not know how to live in harmony with ourselves and our world. I pose this as an honest question. Will we find our way to understand what this land has to say to us by displaying our dead and asking people to pay to peep at penguins? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jonathan, for a fantastic talk. I'm afraid we've run out of time.
No, they can stay.
Well, but it's supposed to be 1 hour. So I'm sure you'll be available for taking questions individually.
Yes.
So I would like I'm sure that some of you may have to run off. So I would like to bring this formal part to a close. But before I do so, I would like to remind you that Jonathan's book is available for purchase, and also please join me in thanking Jonathan for the fantastic lecture.
Thank you.